A struggling single mother spent her last $150 on an abandoned gangster mansion no one else wanted. Everyone warned Carolyn Foster to stay away, but with her 15-year-old son, Jack, facing homelessness, she had nowhere else to go. Then Jack discovered something behind a sealed wall, something that had remained hidden for more than 30 years. What they found would reveal why someone still wanted the mansion's past buried and change their lives forever. Stay with us to see what Jack found. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from today. Carolyn Foster had learned that a life rarely falls apart all at once. Usually, it happens quietly. One bill you can't pay. One meal you pretend you're not hungry enough to eat. One morning when you reach across the bed before you're fully awake, and remember the person who used to sleep there is gone. William had been gone for 3 years. Carolyn was 43 now, raising their 15-year-old son, Jack, alone in a small rental outside Pittsburgh. One night, after Jack went to bed, Carolyn found his sneakers beside the kitchen door. The sole of the right shoe had split almost completely. Black tape held it together. She stared at it for a moment, then opened William's old toolbox and found a roll of heavy-duty tape near the bottom. She sat at the kitchen table and carefully repaired her son's shoe with something his father had left behind. Carolyn didn't cry, not until she finished. The eviction notice was lying 3 feet away. 23 days. That was how long they had. The next morning, Jack stood in the kitchen eating toast when he finally asked the question Carolyn had been dreading. "Mom, if we have to move, can I still stay at the same school?" Carolyn looked at him. He wasn't asking where they would sleep. He was asking if he could keep one small piece of his life unchanged. "We'll figure it out," she said. It was the answer parents gave when they had no answer at all. That evening, Carolyn searched the property listings until nearly midnight. Then she saw it. An abandoned stone mansion in western Pennsylvania. Empty for more than 30 years. Formerly owned by Victor Bolano. Final transfer price? $50. Carolyn read the number 3 times before calling the number beneath the listing. A man answered. When she told him which property she was asking about, the line went strangely quiet. "Mrs. Foster," he finally said, "have you been out there yet?" "No." Another pause. "Then if you're taking your son, go in daylight." Carolyn tightened her grip on the phone. "Why?" The man was silent for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "You'll understand when you see the house." The next morning, Carolyn almost talked herself out of going. Almost. But 23 days had a way of making fear feel like a luxury. She packed 2 sandwiches, filled a thermos with coffee, and drove west with Jack beside her. For the first 40 minutes, neither of them said much. The neighborhoods thinned. Gas stations became farther apart. The road narrowed until faded houses gave way to bare fields and thick Pennsylvania woods. Jack finally looked over. "So what's wrong with it?" Carolyn kept her eyes on the road. "What makes you think something's wrong?" "It's a mansion for $150. Despite herself, Carolyn smiled. Fair point. She hadn't told him about the man's warning. Not yet. A few miles later, their cell signal disappeared. Then they found the gate. 2 stone pillars stood on either side of a rusted iron fence nearly swallowed by vines. Beyond it, an old driveway curved through the trees. Carolyn stopped the car. For a moment, neither of them moved. The mansion stood at the end of the drive. It was enormous. 3 stories of dark gray stone, with tall windows and a wide front porch sagging slightly at one corner. Ivy climbed nearly to the roof. Several shutters hung crooked, and dead leaves covered the steps. But the house itself was still standing. Solid. Stubborn? Jack leaned toward the windshield. That's $150. Carolyn let out a nervous laugh. Apparently, a county property agent was waiting near the front steps. His name was Martin Hale, a thin man in his late 60s with silver hair and the uneasy manner of someone who wanted to finish his business before sunset. He handed Carolyn a folder. Property is transferred as is. No guarantees on plumbing, electrical, roof, foundation, anything. I understand. Martin looked toward Jack. Then back at Carolyn. You know who owned this place? Victor Bellano. Martin's expression changed. Only slightly. But Carolyn noticed. People around here remember that name. He said. What did he do? Martin rubbed one hand across his jaw. Enough. It wasn't an answer. Before Carolyn could ask again, he pulled an old brass key from his pocket. The front door resisted before opening with a deep wooden groan. Cold air drifted out. Inside, dust covered everything. A broad staircase curved toward the second floor. An old chandelier hung above the entrance hall. Furniture remained beneath yellowing sheets, as though someone had expected to return and simply never had. Jack stepped inside first. Mom. Carolyn followed. What? He looked around. This place is huge. She knew what he was thinking. A bedroom of his own. A kitchen where they didn't have to whisper after 10 because of the neighbors. No landlord. No eviction notice. For one dangerous moment, Carolyn could see a future here. Then Martin spoke behind them. If you decide to take it, don't start tearing into things. Carolyn turned. What things? Walls? Floors? Old cabinets? Why would I? Martin looked past her into the dark hallway. People came looking after Bellano disappeared. Police, federal agents, men who weren't either one. Jack stopped exploring. Carolyn felt the temperature in the room differently now. Looking for what? Martin shook his head. If anybody knew, they never said. He placed the key in Carolyn's hand. You've got until 5 to decide. Then he left. They heard his car disappear down the driveway. The house became very quiet. Carolyn walked room to room, making practical calculations because practical calculations were easier than fear. A broken window could be covered. The kitchen sink worked, barely. One downstairs room had a fireplace. The roof would need repairs, but not today. They could survive here. That was enough. Upstairs, Jack wandered into what had once been a bedroom. Mom, come here. Carolyn found him standing with his back against one wall, counting steps toward the window. What are you doing? Checking something. He walked out, entered the bedroom beside it, and counted again. Then he frowned. This room doesn't fit. What do you mean? Jack pointed toward the wall separating the rooms. It should go back farther. Carolyn looked at him. How much farther? Jack counted again. Maybe 6 feet. Carolyn stared at the faded wallpaper. 6 feet of missing space. She remembered Martin's warning. Don't start tearing into things. Leave it alone, she said. Jack opened his mouth to argue. Then both of them heard it. An engine. Carolyn crossed to the window. Far beyond the gate, partly hidden behind the trees, a black sedan sat on the shoulder of the road. No headlights, no movement, just a dark shape behind the branches. Do you know them? Jack whispered. No. They watched. After nearly a minute, the sedan slowly pulled away. Carolyn remained at the window long after it disappeared. 23 days until they lost their rental. $150 for a house large enough to give her son a real bedroom. 6 unexplained feet behind a wall. And now someone watching from the road. Every sensible part of Carolyn told her to put the key down and walk away. Then she looked at Jack. At the room. at the possibility of giving him something that resembled a home again. That afternoon, Carolyn Foster signed the papers. As Martin prepared to leave, he paused beside his car. "You bought yourself a lot of house for $150, he said. Carolyn tried to smile, but Martin didn't. He looked toward the second-floor windows, then back at her. "Just don't assume the house was empty because nobody lived here." And with that, he drove away. The first night, Carolyn and Jack slept in the mansion. Neither of them slept much. They had brought only what they could fit into Carolyn's car: 2 sleeping bags, a few blankets, canned soup, bottled water, a flashlight, and the small framed photograph of William that Carolyn always kept beside her bed. They chose 2 rooms downstairs because the electricity upstairs still didn't work. Before turning in, Carolyn checked the front door twice, then the back door, then every window she could reach. She told herself it was because the locks were old. She knew that wasn't the real reason. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a sound above her. 3 slow knocks. Carolyn opened her eyes. Silence. Then, knock, 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 directly overhead. She reached for the flashlight. "Mom." Jack was already standing in the doorway. "You heard it too." Carolyn nodded. For a few seconds, neither moved. Then she forced a smile she didn't feel. Old houses make noise. Jack looked toward the ceiling. That sounded like somebody knocking. Neither of them went upstairs. By morning, Carolyn had convinced herself it was a pipe. By lunchtime, she almost believed it. Over the next several days, they worked. Carolyn scrubbed decades of grime from the kitchen while Jack carried ruined furniture outside. They opened windows, swept floors, patched cracks, and slowly uncovered the bones of what had once been a beautiful home. For the first time in months, Carolyn noticed something changing in Jack. He was talking more. He made jokes. He claimed the largest upstairs bedroom before Carolyn reminded him that a room without electricity was technically just a very large closet. He laughed. Carolyn hadn't realized how much she missed that sound. Maybe, she thought, they really could make this work. Then Jack found the photograph. It was hidden behind a loose drawer in an old desk upstairs. "Mom, look at this." Carolyn wiped her hands on her jeans and took it. The photograph was old, its edges curled with age. Victor Bolano stood on the front steps of the mansion. Carolyn recognized him from the newspaper photograph she had found online, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, his expression hard and unreadable. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman Carolyn assumed was his wife. And around them were children. Not 1 or 2, at least 9. Different ages, different faces. Carolyn turned the photograph over. Several names had been written on the back. Most had faded. One sentence remained readable. "Keep them here until it's safe." Jack read it over her shoulder. Safe from what? I don't know. That evening, the black sedan returned. Carolyn saw it from the kitchen window. Same place. Same dark shape beyond the gate. This time she stepped onto the porch. The car remained still. Carolyn raised her phone and tried to take a picture. The sedan immediately pulled away. That was when she stopped telling herself it was coincidence. The next morning, she called the county office and asked about Victor Bolano. The woman on the phone went quiet when Carolyn gave the address. "You bought that place?" "Yes." There was another pause. "You should talk to the Historical Records Office." "Why?" But the woman only gave her a number. Carolyn spent the afternoon making calls. The story came together in fragments. Victor Bolano had owned restaurants, trucking companies, warehouses, and several properties across western Pennsylvania during the 1970s and 1980s. Officially, he was a businessman. Unofficially, people whispered about gambling, extortion, stolen goods, and men who disappeared after crossing him. Then, sometime in the early 1990s, Victor vanished. No funeral. No confirmed burial. The mansion was eventually seized, tied up in legal disputes, and left empty. But one retired clerk told Carolyn something strange. People searched that house for years. For what? Money? Probably. Records? Who knows? Did they find anything? If they did, nobody admitted it. That night, Carolyn stood upstairs staring at the wall Jack had measured. 6 feet? She ran her fingers across the faded wallpaper. "Mom!" Jack was behind her. "We should open it." "No. You want to know, too. That doesn't mean we should." Jack folded his arms. "What if there's something dangerous back there? That's exactly why we're leaving it alone." But Carolyn barely slept. The next afternoon, while removing an old wardrobe from that room, Jack called her again. This time, his voice sounded different. "Mom, you need to see this." Behind the wardrobe was a section of wallpaper darker than the rest. Jack peeled back one corner. Underneath was plaster, and running vertically through it was a thin, perfectly straight line. Carolyn's stomach tightened. A seam. Not a crack. A seam. Someone had closed an opening and covered it. They stood there for a long time. Carolyn thought about Martin's warning. The black sedan. The photograph. Keep them here until it's safe. Every instinct told her not to touch that wall. But another thought was harder to ignore. If someone was still watching this house after 30 years, whatever they feared might still be inside it. Carolyn fetched a hammer. "Stay behind me." Jack's eyes widened. "You're actually doing it." "One hole," she said. "We look. That's all." The first strike cracked the plaster. The second broke through. Cold air rushed from the opening. Not the stale smell Carolyn expected. Just cold, dry air. Jack aimed the flashlight through the hole. There's space back there. Carolyn widened the opening. Behind the plaster was another wall-thin wooden paneling, deliberately constructed and hidden. Jack found a recessed metal latch beneath decades of dust. Carolyn hesitated, then pulled it. Something clicked. A narrow section of wall shifted inward. Neither of them spoke. Carolyn pushed. The hidden door opened. Their flashlight beams moved slowly across the darkness. Shelves. Boxes. Dozens of them. A metal filing cabinet. Stacks of old cassette tapes. Bundles of photographs. Documents sealed in plastic. And on a small wooden desk sat a black leather journal. Jack whispered, "What is all this?" Carolyn stepped inside. She opened the nearest box. There was no money. No jewelry. No treasure. Instead, she found birth certificates. Old passports. Photographs of women she didn't recognize. Children. Addresses. Dates. Some names had been crossed out and replaced with new ones. Carolyn picked up one folder. Across the front, someone had written, "Relocated 1986. Another, "Safe do not contact." Another, "New identity approved." Carolyn felt Jack move closer. "Mom, were these people hiding?" "I think so." "From Victor." Carolyn didn't answer. Because she didn't know. She reached for the black journal. The first page contained only a name. Victor Bellano. Carolyn turned several pages. At first, the entries were exactly what she feared. Payments. Names. Meetings. Threats. Things written in the cold language of a man accustomed to controlling other people's lives. Then, halfway through the journal, the handwriting changed. Less precise. More hurried. And so did the words. One sentence stopped Carolyn completely. "I spent half my life teaching people to fear me." Now I'm trying to save a few from the thing that fear created. Carolyn read it twice. Jack was silent beside her. Page after page described women and children being moved through the mansion. New documents. Temporary rooms. Drivers paid to ask no questions. Families sent to other states. Victor Bolano had not been innocent. The journal made that painfully clear. But near the end of his life, something had changed. He had begun helping people escape from the same violent world he had once helped build. Jack looked around the hidden room. So this wasn't where he hid money. Carolyn slowly shook her head. No. What was it? Before Carolyn could answer, Jack's flashlight moved toward the far wall. There was another door, smaller than the first, almost child-sized, and beneath its handle, carved carefully into the wood, were 4 words. For those who need shelter. Jack reached toward it. Carolyn caught his wrist. Wait. Then they heard something downstairs. The unmistakable sound of the front door closing. Carolyn froze. Jack looked at her. Neither of them had left it open. Carolyn switched off the flashlight. The hidden room went completely dark. Then, from somewhere below them, a floorboard creaked. Once, then again. Someone was inside the house. Carolyn held one finger to her lips. Jack nodded. In the darkness of the hidden room, she could hear her own heartbeat. Another floorboard creaked downstairs. Then another, slow, deliberate. Someone was moving through the house. Carolyn reached for her phone. No signal. Of course. She looked around for anything she could use to protect them and found an old iron fireplace poker leaning behind a stack of boxes. She gripped it with both hands. Stay here, she whispered. Jack immediately shook his head. No way. Jack, I'm not letting you go down there alone. For half a second, Carolyn saw William in him. Not his face. His stubbornness. Even now, frightened enough that her hands were shaking, the memory almost made her smile. They stepped out of the hidden room together. The hallway was empty. Carolyn moved toward the staircase. Hello. Nothing. She descended slowly. At the bottom, she saw it. The front door stood several inches open. Cold air moved through the entrance hall. Carolyn was certain she had locked it. They searched the downstairs rooms. No one. But when they reached the kitchen, Jack stopped. Mom! On the dusty floor near the back entrance was a muddy footprint. Large. Fresh. Someone had been inside. Carolyn locked every door again and pushed an old cabinet against the back entrance. That night, she and Jack slept in the same room. Or tried to. By morning, Carolyn had made up her mind. They were leaving. She would find somewhere else, a motel, a shelter, a friend's couch. Anything was better than putting Jack in danger. She began packing before breakfast. Jack watched from the doorway. So that's it. Carolyn folded a blanket. Yes. What about the room? Not our problem. What about those people in the files? Jack, what if somebody's trying to destroy that stuff? Carolyn stopped. I care about those people, but I care about you more. Jack looked down. I know. That quiet answer hurt more than an argument would have. Then he said, I just don't think Dad would have wanted us to pretend we didn't see it. Carolyn closed her eyes. Don't do that. I'm not trying to. Your father isn't here to make this decision. The words came out sharper than she intended. Jack went silent. Carolyn immediately regretted them. But they were true. William wasn't there. Every decision belonged to her now. Every mistake. Every consequence. Every person she failed to protect. Especially Jack. She went upstairs alone to retrieve William's photograph. On the way, she passed the open hidden room. Carolyn stopped. The small door at the far end was still closed. For those who need shelter. She should have kept walking. Instead, she stepped inside. The little door opened with surprising ease. Behind it was not another storage room. It was a bedroom. Small. Windowless. But unmistakably made for children. There were 2 narrow beds, an old wooden rocking horse, a shelf of faded books, and a quilt folded neatly in one corner. Carolyn moved her flashlight across the wall. Then she saw the pencil marks. Height lines. Dozens of them. Different dates. Different initials. Different children. Some stayed only days. Others weeks. Carolyn felt something tighten in her throat. On the bedside table sat a wooden box. Inside was a single envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. On the front, written by hand. For whoever opens this room after me. Carolyn unfolded the letter. Victor Bolano did not ask to be remembered as a good man. He wrote almost the opposite. He admitted that fear had bought him money, loyalty, and power, and then it had taken something from him that none of those things could return. There were names he could never make whole again, families he had damaged, choices he could not undo. Near the bottom, one passage made Carolyn sit down on the little bed. There are things a man can regret and still never deserve forgiveness for. If this house survives me, let it do one decent thing longer than I did. Let it shelter someone who has nowhere safe to go. Carolyn lowered the letter. For 3 years, she had thought of herself as someone trying to get back what she'd lost. Her husband, her security, the feeling that tomorrow could be trusted. But sitting in that forgotten room, Carolyn understood something she had never allowed herself to consider. Maybe moving forward wasn't about getting the old life back. Maybe some doors only opened after the life you planned had disappeared. Victor Bolano could not erase what he had done. One good act could not balance a lifetime of harm. But he had eventually chosen to stop adding to it. And perhaps that was the only kind of redemption some people ever got. Not forgiveness. A different next choice. Carolyn looked at the little beds. Then she thought of Jack downstairs. A boy who had taped his shoes together because he didn't want to burden his mother. She finally understood why this house unsettled her so deeply. It wasn't because it had belonged to a criminal. It was because, somehow, this broken place reminded her of herself. Both had histories they couldn't change. Both were still standing. And perhaps both could still become something different. Then, crash. Glass shattered downstairs. Mom? Carolyn ran. Jack stood in the entrance hall, staring at the broken front window. A fist-sized stone lay on the floor. Something was wrapped around it. Carolyn picked it up. A piece of paper. 4 words written in thick black ink. You found enough. Stop. Jack looked at his mother. Are we still leaving? Carolyn stared at the message. Yesterday, she would have answered immediately. Now she wasn't so sure. Because someone wasn't simply trying to frighten them out of an old mansion. Someone was afraid of what Victor Bolano had left behind. And for the first time, Carolyn began to wonder whether buying that house for $150 had ever really been an accident. Carolyn didn't call the police. Not immediately. She stood in the entrance hall with the note in her hand while Jack swept broken glass away from the doorway. You found enough. Stop. Those 4 words told her something the police might not understand. Whoever had thrown that stone knew what she had found. And if they knew about the hidden room, they might know what was inside those files. Carolyn photographed everything. The broken window. The stone. The muddy footprints from the night before. Then she went upstairs and began copying the documents. Mom, Jack said from the doorway, what are you doing? Making sure this doesn't disappear. For the first time since they bought the mansion, Carolyn wasn't searching for answers. She was protecting them. Among Victor Bolano's papers, she found an old newspaper clipping with one name circled in red. Benjamin Shaw. He had been an investigative reporter in Pittsburgh. Nearly 20 years earlier, Benjamin had published a series of stories about corruption, organized crime, and several businesses once connected to Bolano's associates. Then the investigation stopped. Carolyn searched his name online. Benjamin was 62 now and no longer worked for a major newspaper. She found an email address attached to a small investigative journalism site. She wrote only 3 sentences. My name is Carolyn Foster. I recently purchased Victor Bolano's former home. I found something inside the house that I believe you once spent years looking for. She attached one photograph. Then she waited. 36 minutes later, her phone rang. Mrs. Foster. The man's voice was low and cautious. This is Benjamin Shaw. Carolyn stood. How do I know you're really him? A pause. Then Benjamin said, The photograph you sent me contains the name Daniel Rusk. That name never appeared in anything I published. Carolyn looked toward the hidden room. So I spent 6 years trying to prove Daniel Rusk existed. Benjamin arrived the following afternoon. He looked older than his photographs, gray hair, tired eyes, a worn leather briefcase under one arm. Carolyn showed him only copies, not the originals. Benjamin noticed. Smart, he said. He spent almost 2 hours reading without saying much. Then he reached one page and stopped. His face changed. What? Benjamin removed his glasses. I lost my job because of this name. Carolyn sat across from him. What happened? I accused people I couldn't prove were connected. My source disappeared. My editor backed away. Eventually, so did everyone else. He looked around the room. I thought Bolano took his secrets to the grave. He didn't. No. Benjamin looked at the boxes. He put them in a wall. Carolyn told him about the sedan. The footprint. The broken window. The older man had not appeared yet, but Benjamin's reaction was enough to frighten her. You need to be careful. I have a son. I know that. No, Mrs. Foster. I mean, you need to assume anyone who wants these records may already know your name. As if summoned by the warning, an engine sounded outside. Jack moved to the window. Mom, a dark SUV had stopped near the front gate. This time, someone got out. A man in his late 60s walked slowly toward the house. Gray overcoat. Polished shoes. No hurry. Carolyn stepped onto the porch before he could knock. Can I help you? The man smiled politely. Carolyn Foster. Her stomach tightened. Who are you? His eyes moved briefly toward the upstairs windows. Then toward Jack standing behind her. Your son has his father's eyes. Carolyn went cold. You need to leave. The man gave a small nod. I intend to. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Mrs. Foster, some doors were sealed for a reason. Then he turned around. No threat. No raised voice. Nothing Carolyn could report that would sound as frightening as it felt. Benjamin came to the doorway. He watched the SUV disappear. You know him, Carolyn asked. Benjamin's expression told her enough. I know the name he used 20 years ago. That night, Carolyn packed a bag for Jack. She had made her decision. They would leave in the morning. Then, shortly after 11, someone knocked on the front door. Carolyn froze. 3 soft knocks. Jack appeared at the end of the hallway. Don't open it. Carolyn looked through the curtain. A young woman stood outside in pouring rain. Beside her was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, clutching a backpack against her chest. They were soaked. Terrified. Carolyn opened the door only a few inches. Can I help you? The woman looked behind her toward the road before answering. I was told I could come here. By who? I don't know his real name. Carolyn felt Jack move closer behind her. The woman's voice broke. He said if I could make it to this house, no one would ask questions. Carolyn stared at her. Victor Bolano had been gone for more than 30 years. The hidden bedrooms had been sealed. The records had been forgotten. And yet somewhere, somehow, someone still remembered what this house had once been. The little girl began shivering. Carolyn looked at Jack. Tomorrow morning, they were supposed to leave. Jack looked at the child standing in the rain. Then back at his mother. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Carolyn opened the door wider. Come inside. The woman hesitated. Are you sure? Carolyn thought about Victor's letter. Let it shelter someone who has nowhere safe to go. Then she thought about herself 23 days earlier, sitting at a kitchen table, wondering where she and her son would sleep. Yes, Carolyn said softly. I'm sure. The little girl stepped across the threshold first. And in that moment, the $150 mansion stopped being the place Carolyn had bought because she needed someone to save her. It became the first thing in years that gave her the chance to save someone else. Outside, the rain kept falling, and somewhere beyond the gate, headlights appeared between the trees. The headlights beyond the gate disappeared before Carolyn could see the car. She locked the door anyway. The woman standing in the entrance hall said her name was Rachel. Her daughter was Sophie. Carolyn asked nothing else. Not that night. She gave them the warmest room downstairs, found dry clothes for Sophie, and heated canned tomato soup on the old stove. The little girl ate without speaking. Rachel barely touched hers. Every few minutes, she looked toward the windows. Carolyn recognized that look. It was the look of someone whose body had reached safety before her mind believed it. Later, after Sophie fell asleep, Rachel found Carolyn in the kitchen. You don't even know me, she said. No. I could be lying. You could. Then why did you let us in? Carolyn looked toward the hallway where Jack was laying another log on the fire. Because I know what it feels like to wonder where your child is going to sleep tomorrow. Rachel lowered her eyes. Carolyn didn't ask another question. For once, someone's past could wait until morning. Over the following weeks, the mansion began changing. So did Carolyn. Benjamin helped her contact an attorney named Eleanor Price, who quietly explained what Carolyn could and couldn't legally do. They began building connections with legitimate local services so the house could offer temporary shelter without putting vulnerable families or Jack in greater danger. Carolyn established rules. No one revealed the location publicly. No photographs. No unnecessary names. And no woman had to describe the worst thing that had ever happened to her simply to prove she deserved a locked door and a clean bed. Rachel and Sophie eventually left for a safer, longer-term arrangement. Before they did, Sophie handed Carolyn a folded piece of paper. It was a child's drawing of the mansion. The windows were bright yellow. There were flowers in front. Above the roof, Sophie had written 3 words in uneven letters. The safe house. Carolyn stood in the kitchen holding that picture long after their car disappeared. Jack found her there. You okay? Carolyn nodded, then shook her head, then laughed softly through her tears. I don't know. Jack smiled. That's usually your answer. Carolyn looked at him. When did you get so smart? Probably around the time we bought a gangster mansion for $150. She laughed. A real laugh. The kind William used to pull from her without trying. For a moment, grief didn't leave. It simply made room for something else. Purpose. But the danger had not disappeared. The black sedan returned twice. Benjamin discovered that several names in Victor's records belonged to men who had built respectable lives after Bolano vanished. Businesses. Political connections. Charities. families who had no idea where their wealth had begun. And then Benjamin identified the man who had come to the porch. Charles Varden. Decades earlier, he had worked around Victor Bolano's organization. Now he was wealthy, connected, and publicly respectable. But his name appeared repeatedly in Victor's private records. "He isn't worried about the house," Benjamin told Carolyn. "He's worried about what the house can prove." That night, Carolyn checked Jack's window twice. She found him awake. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Checking if I'm still here." Carolyn sat on the edge of his bed. For a while, neither spoke. Then Jack said, "Maybe we should leave." Carolyn looked at him. Only weeks earlier, he had been the one pushing her to uncover the truth. Now there was fear in his voice. "Real fear. I thought you wanted to stay." "I did." He swallowed. Before that guy knew who Dad was, Carolyn's heart tightened. Jack looked down at his hands. "I don't care about the house. Mom, I don't care about Bolano. I just don't want to lose you too." The words broke something open inside her. Carolyn pulled him toward her. For 3 years, she had been so afraid of failing Jack that she had forgotten something important. He was afraid of losing her too. "I need you to hear me," she whispered. "This house is not more important than you. None of this is. Then why are we still here?" Carolyn didn't answer immediately. Because there had been a time when she would have said survival meant keeping your head down. Pay the bills. Protect your own. Make it to tomorrow. But Rachel and Sophie had changed that. Victor's letter had changed that. And Jack had changed that. "Because being afraid doesn't always mean you're supposed to run," she finally said. "Sometimes it means you need to be careful. Sometimes it means you need help. And sometimes it tells you exactly what matters." Jack looked at her. Carolyn took his hand. "But we do this together, and we do it safely. No secrets between us. No playing heroes." Jack managed a small smile. "Especially you. Especially me." The next morning, Carolyn called Eleanor, then Benjamin. She made copies of every important record and arranged for them to be stored in several secure places. If something happened to the mansion, the evidence would survive. If someone threatened her, other people would know. Carolyn was no longer a frightened widow alone in an abandoned house. She had witnesses. She had allies. She had a plan. And, more importantly, she had finally stopped confusing courage with doing everything by herself. That evening, Carolyn hung Sophie's drawing beside the front door. The crooked mansion, the yellow windows, the safe house. Jack stood beside her. "Think Dad would have liked this place." Carolyn looked around at the cracked plaster, mismatched furniture, patched windows, and the warm light spilling from the kitchen. "I think he would have complained about the roof." Jack laughed. Then Carolyn smiled. "But yes," she said softly, "I think he would have understood." Outside, the old mansion stood beneath the Pennsylvania sky. Once, Carolyn had entered it because she needed somewhere to hide from a life that was falling apart. Now she understood something she hadn't understood then. A safe place wasn't simply somewhere danger couldn't reach you. Sometimes, it was a place where fear no longer got to make every decision. And Carolyn Foster was finally becoming the woman who could keep that door open. 3 days later, Benjamin called just after sunrise. "We're ready." Carolyn stood in the kitchen, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. "Ready for what?" "To publish." She looked through the doorway. Jack was asleep on the couch beneath an old quilt. Sophie's drawing still hung beside the front door. The mansion with the yellow windows. The safe house. Carolyn had spent weeks wondering what would happen when the truth finally came out. Now that moment had arrived, she was terrified. If you publish those names, she said, they'll know everything came from here. They already know. Benjamin paused. The difference is that after today, they won't be able to bury it by frightening one woman and her son. That sentence stayed with her. For years, Carolyn had believed strength meant carrying everything alone. William's death, the bills, Jack's grief, her own grief. She was beginning to understand that some burdens became dangerous precisely because people tried to carry them in silence. Do it, she said. Benjamin published the investigation that morning. By noon, reporters were calling. By evening, state investigators had contacted Eleanor. Within days, records hidden for more than 30 years were being compared against old cases, missing person reports, property transfers, shell companies, and testimony from people who had once been too frightened to speak. Some allegations could be proven. Others could not. Victor Bolano's final years did not erase the damage he had caused. Carolyn insisted on that whenever anyone tried to turn him into a hero. He wasn't a hero, she told Benjamin once. He was a man who finally understood that what he'd built was hurting people. Benjamin nodded and tried to change it. Yes. Carolyn looked toward the hidden room. Too late for some people. That mattered to her. Because redemption, she had learned, was not pretending yesterday had never happened. It was deciding what tomorrow would inherit from you. Charles Varden never returned to the mansion. But the investigation surrounding the old records widened, and the quiet protection of reputation that had lasted for decades began to crack. Carolyn was offered interviews. Television crews wanted to film the hidden room. A producer offered money for exclusive access to the property. She turned them all down. Jack couldn't understand it at first. We could fix the whole roof with what they're offering. Carolyn smiled. Probably the plumbing too. Then why say no? She looked at the room where Rachel and Sophie had slept. Because people who come here shouldn't have to wonder whether their worst day will become somebody else's entertainment. Jack thought about that, then nodded. The mansion never became a museum. It became something quieter. With Eleanor's help, Carolyn worked with legitimate organizations to make the property a small transitional refuge. The broken windows were replaced. The locks were strengthened. The roof was repaired one section at a time. People donated beds. A retired carpenter repaired the staircase. Someone brought books. Someone else brought winter coats. And slowly, the house people once crossed the road to avoid became a place where frightened families could sleep without listening for footsteps outside their door. Years passed. Jack grew taller than William had been. He finished high school. Then college applications began appearing on the kitchen table where unpaid bills once sat. On Jack's final evening before leaving home, Carolyn found him on the front porch. The sun was dropping behind the Pennsylvania trees. For a while, they sat without speaking. "You remember our first day here?" Jack asked. Carolyn laughed softly. "I remember wondering if the floor was going to collapse. I thought you'd lost your mind." "You weren't entirely wrong." Jack smiled. Then his expression changed. "You know what I remember most?" "What?" "You being scared." Carolyn looked at him. "I was terrified." "I know." He stared toward the driveway. "But you kept going anyway." Carolyn felt her throat tighten. Jack was quiet for another moment. Then he said the words she had not known she needed to hear. "Dad would have been proud of what you did here. Mom." Carolyn looked away. For 3 years after William died, she had secretly wondered whether she had failed him. Failed Jack. Failed the little family they had built together. Now her son was sitting beside her, grown enough to leave, telling her something different. She reached for his hand. "I think he'd be pretty proud of you, too."